1 Corinthians chapter 7. That'll be where we are in our Bible study. We're picking up here in just a moment where we left off a couple of weeks ago. We'll review and remind ourselves of what we saw in the earlier part of this chapter, and then we'll pick up down in verse 17. And we'll pick up here in just a minute. Before we get into the chapter itself, just a quick reminder of our outline we're following and the theme of the book. Now, the book of 1 Corinthians is about contentions among you. And the book itself, the entirety of it, is really Paul dealing with problem after problem after problem with the church at Corinth. Moment. My microphone has died. I keep extra batteries in here. The book itself is just Paul dealing with all sorts of problems. And the first 6 chapters, which we've already covered, is problems that Paul had learned by report. And so he had learned by report about the contentions or divisions among them. Remember where they were choosing who was their favorite preacher. I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas. And some then, having it right, I am of Christ. And so there was this division that was taking place. In those first 4 chapters, Paul is reminding them that they need to have the proper view of the preacher and his work. And that what the preacher is teaching is God's word and not his own wisdom. And they were judging these men like they were the philosophers of the day and judging them by man's viewpoint and not looking at it from the standpoint of them teaching the truth. And Paul had to deal with that in the first 4 chapters. Chapters 5 and 6, we've got some problems about fornication. Chapter 5, the problem of the lack of discipline. And chapter 6, going to law against one another, the problem there of litigation. Chapter 7 through 14 is some questions the Corinthians had asked Paul. They had some questions about marriage. That's where we are. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Lord willing, Wednesday evening we'll begin chapter 8. The outline, by the way, is on that table if you need an outline for chapter 8. Chapters 8, 9, and 10 all deal with the same problem, and that is some questions about meat sacrifice to idols and liberties. Chapter 11, questions and problems concerning the covering and of the Lord's Supper and their use of it. Chapter 12 through 14, some questions they had about spiritual gifts. The chapter 15 was false teaching on the resurrection, and chapter 16 was the collection for the needy saints and some salutations given there in chapter 16. We're in chapter 7, the first chapter of that second main division on questions they had asked Paul. And so chapter 7 is questions about marriage. As we pointed out a week and a half ago, we were here last in this text. We don't know exactly what the questions are, but we can kind of piece it together based on the response that Paul's giving. We used the illustration, if I was on that Wednesday night, if somebody was out in the foyer and you heard them say, you heard them say on the phone, yes, we meet at 7, you would conclude somebody must have asked them, are you meeting? What time do you meet? Something along those lines about when we were meeting that evening. And so sometimes from the answers that are given, we can kind of piece the questions. And it seems they have some questions about should they be married in light of some things going on. We'll come back to that key verse here in a moment. If they're already married, should they divorce? What about the marriage between believer and unbeliever? Should they get a divorce? What about children born in those marriages? Are those legitimate children? These seem to be some of the questions they had about marriage. We pointed out the last time the key in understanding this chapter is verse 26. In fact, if you highlight in your Bible, I would recommend you highlight that verse. On my iPad here, I have it, in my Bible program, I have when a key verse in a chapter, they have an outline for a star. I have a star next to it. It reminds me when I'm going through. This is the key verse to this text. The key to understanding chapter 7, I think, is verse 26. And so we're going to, we'll review here in a minute some of these controversial things we saw a couple of weeks ago in the early part of the chapter. But I think the key is verse 26, and in particular, these 2 important words, present distress. And so Paul writes and says, I think in view of the present distress, It is good for a person to remain as he is. Now, that something was taking place. It seems intense persecution. There's some debate. Was it widespread or more narrowed in on Corinth? I don't know. And it doesn't matter. The people here were impacted by it. And it was something that, though it seems would be short, verse 29, this is what I mean, brothers, the appointed time has grown very short. So perhaps this distress was something that wasn't going to last long, but Paul's pointing out and giving some things about questions they've got in light of this present distress. And that helps us in understanding some things in this text, especially some things that if we don't look at it in that light, seem contradictory to other statements that are made in the Scripture. We'll hit some of those here in just a moment. So again, if you highlight your Bible, I encourage you to highlight verse 26, or write a note out next to it. If you write in the Bible, key verse. That verse will help you in your understanding of chapter 7. Here's a few things we saw already. 1 through 7, there were some things about celibacy and marriage. He said in verse 1, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, but one should marry instead of committing fornication in verse 2. 3 through 4, he talks about the responsibility for one to meet their mate's needs. And then 5 and 6 to only deprive by consent. And as we pointed out when we got to those verses, it was only for a limited time and to devote themselves to prayer and by agreement. And then in verse 7, he said he wishes that others were like he. I wish that all were as I myself am. So that's one of those verses, again, and it's brought up a few other times later on, that verse 7 is, and some others, that when you look at it, you think, well, wait a minute, doesn't that contradict some other things? And that is, Paul says, verse 7, I wish others were as I myself am. He comes down in the next section, in his advice to those that are unmarried, or never married, and those that are widows, and says, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. Now wait a minute, in Genesis chapter 2, didn't God create woman because it was not good for man to what? Be alone. Now you take a step back for just a second, you look at that and you say, now wait a minute. Paul says it's good to remain single, and yet God made woman because it was not good for man to be alone. Why is that? Let's go back to our key verse. What's the key verse in understanding this chapter? In light of the present distress. That's going to be explained more in some passages we're going to get to in a moment, why that is that advice is given. We'll see that when we get down to verse 17 here in just a moment, where we left off. 10 and 11 then. He talks about to those that are already married. He says, to the married I give this charge, not I but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. We pointed out that some will argue that they could that this here is not talking really about divorce and all this and stuff. Well, this word separate means divorce. The lexicographers say this word separate is used of divorce. It's the same word that is rendered separated in Matthew 19:6, or in the Old King James, they should not put asunder. It's the same Greek word that's found in 1 Corinthians 7 and in verse 10. In verse 11, a different Greek word is used, but on that standpoint, instead of saying separated, the word chosen is the word that simply is translated divorce. And then, in verse 7, whatever this separation or departing is, leaves one unmarried. He said in verse 11, she should remain unmarried. Not become unmarried, remain unmarried. So whatever separation took place, they are no longer married. So we pointed out this is referring to divorce. And some will argue from this, well, you see that you can divorce as long as you don't remarry, so you should remain unmarried. And we looked at this and paralleled this passage in 1 Corinthians 7 with 1 John. It's not permission, but rather, here's what you do if you've already done what you shouldn't have done. 1 Corinthians 7:10. You shall not separate. That's verse 10. Verse 11. Look again at verse 11. But if she does. Now 1 John chapter 2. You may not, or it's not sin. My little children, the same I write to you that you sin not, one translation says. The very next phrase says, but if anyone does sin. I would argue that if 1 Corinthians 7, 10 and 11, based on the construction of the language, gives permission to divorce as long as you remain unmarried, that 1 John is arguing you could sin if you chose to. It's the same construction of the language. The point is not you can do this as long as you do this, but rather if you've already done what you shouldn't do, here's what you do. We use this illustration. A couple gets divorced. They get divorced. She obeys the gospel and realizes, you know what? It wasn't scriptural. She goes back to him, and he says, I'm not going to take you back. They can't reconcile. Then what she must do is remain unmarried. Also, the argument that one could divorce and not remarry means that the reconciliation and the unmarried are equal. And I don't think that's true at all. The point that reconciliation should be the first goal. And then if that's not possible, that's when one is to remain unmarried. Verse 12 then through verse 16 talks about the believer and the unbeliever. There was instructions to the believer in 12 through 14. He says in verse 12, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. We noted this real quick the other day. There's a phrase that says, not I, but the Lord, and then I, not the Lord. He's not saying it's not inspired. We know from 2 Timothy 3 that all Scriptures give inspiration. Rather, back in verse 10, the situation he's dealing with, that question, we could go find the answer to that question by going to Matthew chapter 19, and where it says, do not divorce, and do not put asunder. In fact, as we said, the same Greek word was used for separate here as is used in Matthew 19. They had some questions specifically about the believer and unbeliever. Jesus didn't deal specifically with that. I think Matthew 19 clearly would deal with that. Right? Matthew 19 and that rule deals with that. That's the rule for marriage. But they had questions about this, and so there's some specifics that Paul's dealing with that weren't specifically addressed in what Christ had to say. The question that they have seems to be, should they divorce, and is this marriage a legitimate marriage? Do they have a right to be married? And are any children born in this legitimate children? Verse 14 says, for the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. I think that's pointing out that they have a right to be married, as long as neither one bound anybody else. And in fact, the children are legitimate children because they were born in a relationship in which they had the right to have. Verse 15 then asks the question, what if the unbeliever departs? And the point is made, if the unbeliever departs, that the believer is not enslaved to them, verse 15. I pointed out, I think the indication is in 15 and 16 that the unbeliever departs because of this persecution under this present distress. I think that's the point being made. It seems if the unbeliever separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has not called you. I think the point in understanding this is they've departed because of the belief of the one who is a Christian. When they leave, you're not, some say, in verse 15, bound, but as others say they're not enslaved. That's not the same thing as the marriage bond of Romans chapter 7 there in verse 15. Some use that passage to argue if they leave, you're free to remarry. Okay, that's not what it says. He uses the term enslaved, and the point is, you're not enslaved to have to go after them and compromise your faith to save that marriage. We pointed that out last time as well. The point is that they're not to try to compromise their faith when that one departs. But that term is the word enslaved. It's not the same as the bond that we talk about in Romans 7 that's even brought up later on here in this chapter. We're ready for verse 17 now. This is where we're ready to pick up. After we've quickly reviewed through that, verse 17 beginning, here's some general principles that are given. First principle, remain as you were called. Only that each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his calling already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at this time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord is a bondservant, is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when he was called as a bondservant of Christ. Skip down to verse 24. We'll come back to 23 in a minute. So, brothers, in whatever condition each one was called, let them remain with God. So, here's the point of this section. Don't try to change your circumstances in light of this present distress. So some of them who are married might say, well, listen, you just said it's good not to be married. So, let's get a divorce. We're going to divorce, and then we're going to not be married, and then we don't have to worry about that. And again, we're going to get here in a minute to some specifics as to why the advice is given. And the point that's being made is, with all this going on, don't think, well, I need to go change my circumstances. Were you married when you were called? Don't seek to be unmarried. Were you not married when you were called? Then don't seek to be married. Right? Were you a bondservant? Don't seek to be free. Were you free? Well, nobody really seeks to be a bondservant, but don't go to become enslaved. Were you circumcised? Don't seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Were you uncircumcised? Don't seek to be circumcised. Remain as you were called. Remember this principle, verse 23. You were bought with a price. So, brothers, in whatever condition, verse 24, you were called, therefore remain with God. Do not become the bondservants of men, he said in verse 23. The point is, don't try to change your circumstances with everything going on and say, well, I've got to make this dramatic change. Remain in the condition you were called. Now, there's one very important note we need to make about this. The question comes up. As he says, verse 24, in whatever condition each one was called, there let him remain with God. Some go to this section and argue, well, you see, you can stay in a relationship that's not right because he said, stay in whatever condition you were in when you were called. That's clearly not the point. So again, some have used this to argue staying in a sinful relationship. Well, here's a marriage, and they don't have a right to be married to one another. And now they've obeyed the gospel. Well, remain in the condition in which you were called, even though that marriage is contrary to God's law. Now you can remain in the condition in which you were called. That's what some would argue. It's simply not true. In fact, I said a couple of things. First of all, it violates other biblical principles. Right? In Bible study, the first key we often talk about in Bible study, or the first two keys, is text, the text itself we're reading, and then context, right? Whatever surrounds it. And then the third thing we have to consider is other text. Well, what this would be saying, if that's true, just stay however you are, is if you're in that adulterous relationship that's talked about in other passages like Matthew 19, just go ahead and stay in it. That would violate that biblical principle. That's not what he's teaching. Also, I think it's important to understand the advice given, as he says, when you obey the gospel, if you're unmarried, don't try to seek to be married. If you're married, don't try to unmarry yourself and get unmarried. And the point is, they're trying to change their circumstances because of what? Verse 26, present distress. Some of them are saying, in light of this, do we need to change our circumstances? And the answer is no. But the verses here do not teach that one can remain in an adulterous relationship. Now, already a little bit of explanation about some of these things that we've seen already. As we've gone through the text, we see time and time again, as we pointed out, and we're finally going to get to verse 26 in the surrounding verses. But we've been talking about this point of this present distress and everything. We're finally going to get here where, as their instructions are given to virgins in 25 through 38, there's an explanation as to why it is, in light of this present distress, they should remain unmarried. Look at verse 25, beginning. Let's read through verse 31 and come back and talk about it. Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I get my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they have none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. Or we'll pick up verse 32 in a minute. So he points out in these verses here in 25 through 31 about that present distress, right? He says in verse 25, I have no command from the Lord. That is, if you choose to marry, in fact, he's going to point that out later on in the verse. The advice is, in light of this present distress, it's best not to marry. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, he's going to point that out later on, but that's the advice given in light of this present distress. He says in verse 27 now, and this is another important one. You'll notice as we go through and we say this verse doesn't mean, and we're explaining what it says and then what it doesn't mean. This is a chapter that's often misused and twisted to argue different positions on marriage and divorce. Verse 27, are you bound to a wife, not seek to be free? Are you free from a wife, not seek to be bound? But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Now, verse 27, are you bound to a wife? I think verse 27 would be pointing out here is talking about the actual marriage bond. But here's where some of them come to some confusion. If you're bound, don't seek to be free. And some of them say, well, you see, if you're married and you're in a relationship you shouldn't be in, don't seek to be free. Again, same argument from the previous verse. Problem is they have to confuse something. They're confusing the marriage and the bond. Romans chapter 7, we saw this in Romans chapter 7. It is possible for somebody to be married to one person and yet bound to somebody else. That's why subsequent marriages, when there's a divorce that shouldn't take place, or one's the guilty party, are adultery, because they're bound to somebody else. And what happens is some come here and say, but if you do marry, verse 28, you've not sinned. Well, you see, if you marry, it's not a sin, not a problem. Well, and they'll say, well, you see, you can marry even if divorced, based on the use of the word loosed or free. Here's the problem. That's not talking about being loosed or free from marriage, but rather loosed or free from being bound. No, they're not married, but they were never married. Or, later on he talks about widows, their spouse died, but the advice he's given is to those who have not been married. And he says that you, if you've not been married, can get married. The point is this, we need to understand, he's not arguing here that one can marry if divorced. Rather, he's pointing out if you're not married and you choose to marry, if you're not bound and you choose to marry and become bound to somebody, there's nothing wrong with that. Now come down to verse 32. Here's the reason for the instructions that have been given. Verse 32 through 35. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided, and the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Here's his point in 32 through 35. When somebody's married, one of the things they're concerned about is not just their service to God, they're also concerned about their relationship with their spouse. The married man is concerned about his wife and how to please her, and she is about him. And the point is, in light of this, again, going back to verse 26, very important verse, in light of the present distress, it seems short period of intense persecution, if there's somebody that's unmarried, and their life comes down to it, their decision they're making in reality is only about them. When somebody's married, in this intense persecution in their life they life, they may also consider their spouse and their kids. Doesn't mean they can't be faithful. They can be. There are examples clearly of those. Peter was married. We see about his mother-in-law being healed. Peter later served as an elder in the Lord's church. Peter was married.
A person living in this time of persecution would still be responsible for life for their own, or else they'd be worse than an infidel. So, yeah, that regulates this too. That responsibility one has to his own, and he couldn't say, well, there's present distress, so I can just forget about what was said about if any man provide not his own, he's worse than infidel. No, he would have to navigate through, in spite of this distress, still being obedient to that command.
You're right, and even going back to the earlier part of the chapter, in a term we didn't talk about today, but we talked about last time. In verse 3, the husband gave to his wife her conjugal rights, or that which is due her, which was his debt to be paid. Specifically in that text, it's talking about the sexual relationship. But I think that clearly, in other passages, I think would point this out when he talks about dwelling with understanding, there's the responsibility of the husband to meet the wife's needs, and the wife to meet the husband's needs, and those are things that they need to be concerned about, right? They need to meet their mate's needs. And in light of all this going on, their attention with all this intense persecution may start to become divided. Again, it doesn't mean they can't remain faithful. They can. There were clearly people in Scriptures that were faithful and faced persecution, like Peter, who were married. But the point that's being made is, if you're not married and you can remain unmarried, not that they have the pool where they may be guilty of sin, as we talked about earlier. But if you're one who says, okay, you know what, I'll remain unmarried in the midst of this present distress, then that's good because your attention's not divided. He's not saying it's wrong for you to have to worry about these other things. In fact, that's important to have to deal with these other things with your mate, meeting the needs, etc. But the attention may be divided. Verse 36 through 38 now. If anyone thinks that he's not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So that he who marries his betrothed does well, he who refrains from marriage will do better. He points out here in this instruction about those that are betrothed, listen, if they don't get married, great. Then if they decide not to get married right now in light of the present distress, they don't have those concerns you just talked about. But if they decide, you know what, we're going to go ahead and get married. If they, he talks about in the previous verses here, if he's not behaving properly, if his passions are strong, and they say, you know what, we're going to go ahead and we're going to get married, even in this present distress, it is no sin. There's not a commandment here. It was here's what's probably best, here's what's best in light of the circumstances. But it's not wrong to marry. Now, that should have 39 and 40, the last section of Scriptures here. So we talk about widows in the couple minutes we have remaining. So he's giving advice now. He's talking about celibacy and marriage. He gave some advice early with the unmarried and widows. Then he gave advice to those already married. Then to those that are married, believer or unbeliever. Or believer and unbeliever. Here's some general principles that in reality apply to everybody. Remain, if you can, remain as you were called. Here's some instructions to those that are virgins and why this advice is given. And finally, here's advice to widows, 39 and 40. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. What's he talking about in verse 39? You're bound? That's the marriage. That's this bond that we always talk about. Not just marriage. It's the bond in Romans 7. She's maybe married to him, but even if they divorce, she's bound to him as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes. She's free of that bond, right? That bond no longer exists. Only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. I want to focus in our time that remains on one phrase at the end of verse 39. Because everything else we've already discussed to a point. Verse 39, this is another one, not a twisted one, but one there's questions about. Only in the Lord. So I'm going to give you their three positions, and I'll tell you which one I think fits best. The first position is, marry in the Lord, is it must be in harmony with the Lord's Word. So, it must be a marriage that is Scripture. That's one position there is on the text. The other position is, it must be a Christian, and that this applies to all time. And the third position is, she should marry a Christian in light of the present distress. So let's go through here. We would all agree that marriage must be in harmony with the Lord's Word. But I don't think that's what this text is pointing out. The next point is that argument must be a Christian that applies to all times. Now, somebody says, what's your advice? My advice would be you should marry somebody that is a Christian. But then there are clearly passages like we saw earlier that would point out that it's not sinful If the marriage between a believer and unbeliever was sinful, then what he would have told them in 12 through 16 was they needed to get out of that marriage. But it's not sinful, right? They're holy. The children, it's a legitimate marriage. There are other passages that bring it up. I think the one that fits the text is the third one. She should marry a Christian in light of the present distress. There are going to be all these pressures around to give in this persecution. If you're married to one that is a Christian, it makes it a little bit easier for them to remain firm. Right now, they may be concerned about their spouse, but their spouse is also concerned about serving the Lord and not just meeting their needs and about them. And I think that's the point that fits the text best. It should be a Christian in light of the present distress. Lord willing, we'll pick up Wednesday evening and we'll start in chapter 8. And again, the outlines from chapter 8 are on